The Sony a7R3 was released 3 years ago to generally very positive reviews. It solved a lot of practical issues that its predecessor, the a7R2, had. I have owned this for 2.5 years and it has been my main photography camera, and I have also used it quite a lot for videography. I usually make videos focused on the image taking process of landscape photography, but because of some serious back pain issues I've suffered from lately, I haven't been able to get out. Luckily, I am getting better by the day, so instead I decided to share my thoughts on and experiences with my main camera, the Sony a7R3. So in this video I'll discuss why I chose the a7R3, share my thoughts on battery life, weather resistance, an obnoxious error message, the screen, the a7R3 as a film camera, firmware updates, accessories, image quality, low light performance and the pixel shift function, shooting and preserving highlights, the infamous menu system, and lenses. In the end, I'll sum up the beefs I have with the camera and a discussion on price. I got the a7R3 for a few different reasons. One of them were low light performance. So the camera I had before was the Canon 5DS and it simply just was not built for landscape low light performance. The highest ISO it goes up to is 6400 and you can extend that to 12,000, and yeah, it's just grainy like crazy. But this bad boy here, this one can take it all, and especially also for videoing. And when I'm talking about videoing, I'm talking about videoing and filming the northern lights, and this was just like such a huge upgrade for me. Like, this is still one of the best cameras out on the market for filming in low light, filming the northern lights. Now, the reason why I changed to Sony 2.5 years ago was simply because there weren't a lot of competitors to Canon. Canon only had their 5D Mark IV back then, and it only had 30 megapixels, whereas I was used to 50 megapixels, so I didn't want to compromise those 50 megapixels. The only other alternative to the Sony cameras back then, if I wanted to keep up with resolution, was the Nikon D800 series, so the D810 or the D850. And when it comes to Nikon, I'm a little bit more skeptical, not so much because of image quality or anything like that. Nikon cameras or Sony cameras or even Canon cameras, you can hardly see the difference, but simply just because of the practicalities of the camera itself. So the D850 is quite a big camera, and I wanted to go with something that was a little bit smaller. And since I already were used to some Sony cameras, it was fairly easy to transition my main camera from Canon to Sony, and I could simply just put the bottoms here on top and design the camera bottoms in more or less in the same way as I had my Canon cameras. So I went with the a7R3 over the a7R2 for mainly two reasons. One reason is the improved battery, and back then the a7R2 had terrible battery. It still used the batteries that we have in the A6000 series. At no point the past 2 years, even with a heavy day of use, have I needed more than 2 batteries for 1 day of shooting, and that includes both filming 4K and taking a lot of photos. The second reason why I went with this one over the a7R2 was the improved weather resistance. Now, back then, and well, it's technically still, I take a lot of photos in the Faroe Islands and Iceland, and the weather there can be absolutely terrible. So it was important for me to have a camera that could take a little bit more beating than the a7R2 could. I have had this camera here dripping with water and keeping up and not dying. The sad thing is that the A7 series, it seems like it's generally all of them, have this obnoxious error message that when the hot shoe gets wet, it pops up with a message where it says that it does not recognize that I'm trying to fit some kind of external hardware to the camera. Obviously I'm not, but this obnoxious error message keep popping up and you have to press a button to get rid of it, and then it kind of pops up again just after. So it can be quite frustrating when that error message starts popping. It is also important for me to say that this is actually my second a7R3 body. I did push my first body quite a bit too much on a night at Solstice in Iceland, where I had like the tripod out in the water and I did have salt water squelching up underneath the camera, and it did hit the camera, and there was also a lot of moist in the air and probably also a lot of salt in that moist, and that meant that the screen for some reason simply just died. The camera continued to function, but the screen died. So yeah, it's good to have an insurance on these cameras, and don't push it as much as I do. So another reason that I really wanted to go with the Sony system was the tilt screen here. So sadly it's not a fully articulating screen. I would really like that, but I do often find myself needing this tilt screen, either because I'm like very low to the ground and need to be able to see the screen, or with my new tripod I often find myself to be very up high, and then I can just tilt it down. Sadly, the tilt screen is completely useless if I am doing vertical photos, and as you know, I'm taking quite a lot of vertical photos with this camera. So in that regard, Sony, please, for the love of all photographers using and buying your cameras, will you please implement a fully articulating screen in the upcoming A7 models? Please? Is it too much to ask for? Another thing that is positive about the screen here on the Sonys is that it is a touch screen. Now, why Sony never made it a fully functional touchscreen is beyond me, but nevertheless you can actually use it to either focus, like point on the screen where you want to focus or where you want to meter. Now I'm almost only using it for focusing, and I do that when I focus stack my images. So in regard to video, the 5DS only had full HD, and the Sony a7R series had 4K, and that was also a reason why I changed to this system, so that all my cameras could film in 4K, and I could use this camera here to make both B-roll and film myself either vlogging or talking to the camera. As you've seen, I've done that quite a lot. Now, since this camera was released, there have been released more and better 4K video cameras. But when it comes to a fully functional all-round camera, this one here still have more than sufficient image quality in regard to video and filming for my needs, that's for sure. And not to mention that the low light video quality is still absolutely outstanding for this one. And yeah, here's some more B-roll with some northern lights just straight out of the camera. If you want to know more about composition in landscape photography, be sure to get my ebook on the subject. You can get the free light version of the ebook by signing up for my newsletter. Another huge advantage of the Sony cameras is that Sony regularly actually updates the firmware with new features. So one of those big firmware updates was, I think it was 2.0 or 2.1 or something like that, where they actually added the intervalometer into this camera. Obviously, it should have been there from the beginning, but nevertheless, we finally got the intervalometer, and it is a function that I use so much, especially when I'm photographing myself. So I just put up the camera, put it on the intervalometer, walk out into the field and get the photo where I myself are posing out there for the camera and add some scale to the photos. So as you can see, the camera is actually fairly small, and even with my small hands, it doesn't really fit in my hand that well. The solution to that is an L bracket that you simply just put underneath it. So as you can see here, when I've attached my small rig L bracket here, I can actually use my entire hand to hold the camera. And on top of that, of course, the L bracket is for turning your camera very quickly and attach it to your tripod. So an L bracket comes highly recommended to the a7R3. As you can see, this specific L bracket actually comes with one of those 1/4 inch screws down there in the bottom. So I can actually attach my Peak Design capture clip to the L bracket. And that is also a really nice solution, so you can just hold the camera on your backpack here on the side. So I only briefly mentioned image quality, and the a7R2 already had amazing image quality with the 42 megapixel sensor and outstanding low light performance. It is essentially the exactly same sensor that they put in the a7R3. And even to this date here, 5 years after the release of the a7R2 and 3 years after the a7R3 was released, that many of the cameras on the market that gets released today are still playing catch up with this camera. Let's see here in 2020 if they can finally beat this sensor, but for now it is really good. And with 42 megapixels, I can make absolutely huge prints that are super sharp. You can just look at the photo here behind me. That is just a single exposure 42 megapixels with this one. I have arguably been quite heavy-handed with this photo because I had to use quite a lot of denoise with it. And as you can see, the details are just amazing. Another photo that I also have is this one here of the oak tree. And if I go very close, you can easily see the individual acorns on this tree here. It is super sharp, and this print is quite big also. So my main point when it comes to assessing the image quality of the a7R3 is that I don't really feel that I'm missing out by not having more megapixels. 42 megapixels is more than sufficient if you have acceptably sharp lenses to put in front of it. And another argument is, of course, that by having this urge to keep upgrading to more and more megapixels, does that mean that your 20 megapixels photos are outdated? Especially my print sales and my Instagram likes still shows that you can definitely use a 20 megapixel camera. And in the end, nobody can see the difference between 42 megapixels and 60 megapixels unless you pixel peep. So yeah, again, I don't really honestly feel that I'm missing out by not having 60 megapixels in my main camera. Now the a7R3 also came with this fantastic feature called Pixel Shift. I have tried it out a few times, and what it does is simply that it is supposedly taking a photo, 4 photos that you can put together, and then it makes it a super sharp image. And in all honesty, it is extremely impractical to use. And if there's just the slightest amount of movement in your landscape, let's say a waterfall or some fast moving clouds, maybe even like, stars, the rotation of the earth, you can't use it. It's completely useless unless the scene you have in front of you is completely still. So yeah, I never use it. Where the a7R3 and the other a7R cameras just completely blows many other cameras out of the water is when it comes to retrieving shadow detail. You can highly underexpose a photo taken with this camera and bring out shadow details almost without any noise. Of course, there will always be noise. Back in the days with the 5DS, I had to bracket everything and either HDR blend my photos or use luminosity masks. But these days with the a7R3, I rarely have to blend more than 2 photos, and I can get away with a single exposure in probably 80 to 90% of the times I take a photo. Another thing I really enjoy about my a7R3 is that it has this sunny weather screen brightness. So what it means is that I can just push the screen brightness quite far up so I can see it in sunny weather. Now, the only drawback to that is that sometimes it's very hard to determine whether or not you are overexposing your photos, because they look very overexposed when you look on them at the screen. So always make sure to either use the histogram to check your highlights or use the zebra stripes. I have my zebra stripes set for 100, which means that I'm still good as long as I see zebra stripes, but when they start outblowing the zebra stripes, if that makes any sense, then I know I am about to overexpose my photos. But as long as I see my zebra stripes, when I have them on 100, I'm good to go. So Sony is also known for their infamous menu system. And in all honesty, having used Sony for 2.5 years now and having had other cameras from Sony since 2015, it's really not a big issue. It's really not a big issue. As I started out by saying, I just put whatever I need on all these buttons here so they are easy to get to. And within the menu system, there is also a favorites menu system. And when you slowly find out what features that you use in the camera the most, you simply just add them to that menu. An alternative is, of course, to use your function button. So as you can see here I can also change the different features of the camera. In my humble opinion, I actually think in many ways, but that's of course because I'm biased that I use Sony all the time, that the menu system is fairly easy to use on the Sony cameras. Yes, it has a ton of features, and yes, it is very hard to find all those features in the menus, but it is very easy to put them into shortcut menus so you know where they are and you can easily change the different features and settings of the camera. So over the years, Sony has of course also released many more new lenses. So the Sony lens lineup is more or less on par with Nikon and Canon, and there are of course also a lot of third-party companies such as Sigma and Tamron and Laowa, and even someone called Iris, something like that, that creates lenses specifically for the Sony system. So when it comes to lenses, you have a lot to choose from. So my only beefs with the a7R3 is that the screen is not fully articulating and it is not a fully functional touchscreen. It is also still a huge annoyance with the obnoxious error message that happens each time the hot shoe gets wet. The price of the GM lenses is, in my humble opinion, just outrageous compared to Nikon and Canon lenses and third-party lenses. They are great lenses, but they are also very expensive. Since the a7R3 is a mirrorless camera, you can actually see the sensor in here. So there's a little bit of glass in front of the sensor, so it's not the real sensor that's exposed there, but you still get quite a lot of dust spots on the sensor. And I know that Sony has made a firmware update to their A9 series, so the shutter closes down whenever you change lens. Please Sony, can you make a firmware update to this one too, so we can actually protect our sensors each time we change lenses and we don't have to clean our sensors that much. And of course, improved weather resistance is always appreciated. So in the end, should you get the a7R3? I would say yes. If you're a Sony shooter already and you have the a7R2, I would say yes, it warrants an upgrade, especially now that the a7R3 is fairly cheap. Should you get the a7R4? Personally, I wouldn't say that the upgrades warrant the $1,000 difference. In Denmark, it's even like $1,500 difference. But it is up to you whether or not you need those 60 megapixels and the other minor updates. Canon is about to release the R5, seems like it, and the hype is huge around this camera. Does that warrant a change of system back to Canon for me? Probably not, no. It seems that Sony is also just about to announce the a7S3, probably that's going to be the name, and if the rumors are right that it is going to be an 8K camera, we can probably expect a pretty high megapixel stills camera also, so something above 40 megapixels. if that's the case and the low light performance has increased since the A7S II, maybe that could warrant an upgrade for me. But remember, it is not the camera that takes the photos, it is you. And if you want to learn more about composition in landscape photography, be sure to get my 2 ebooks on that subject. They are both very easy to read and they are full of examples. They both have a concluding chapter where I analyze some of my own photos and show how I implement my thoughts on composition into those photos. There are links to all of it, including all my gear, down in the description. So these were my very practical and hands-on thoughts on the Sony a7R3 3 years after the release. It's a fantastic camera and it comes highly recommended even in 2020. So thank you so much for watching and be sure to also check out this video.